Let's see, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's a real pleasure to be up here with Angela, whom I had the pleasure of meeting last summer or the summer before last, I can't remember.
It's all a blur, it's all a blur.
Just after you had won the Booker Prize together with Georgi Gospodinov last summer, right? Yeah. So it was nice to be, I'd been invited courtesy of the Bulgarians to Sozopol, and a beautiful place on the Black Sea, and I had never previously been to Bulgaria, so that was the beginning of an introduction to a rich literature and a rich culture about which I was chiefly ignorant until that point. And that, you know, I mean, it was the introduction, and learning, of course, goes on after you're introduced to something you didn't really know before. And so I was pleased to be asked to do this because it was a book I'd never heard of, and my own job is to sort of find books that people have never heard of. So I felt a little bit of jealousy that this book had been found by another publisher. Kudos to Sandorf Passage. And then a good deal of curiosity about this big historical novel from, I believe, 1967. So from a period that I always think is, I think the literature that came out of the communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe under Soviet domination and so on, is literature that was not much paid attention to in the United States and has all sorts of riches which are only, I think, beginning to emerge. And here again is a case in hand. Anyway, all that said, I enjoyed the book a great deal. And to begin our conversation, I wanted to say that historical novels come in sort of two forms. One is historical novels about things that the audience knows all about, or knows a lot about, like the American Revolution or the French Revolution or the Civil War. And then there are historical novels about things that actually you're largely ignorant about. That's certainly the case, in this case, of the history behind this book, which is set in the late 1400s on the borderlands between, really, you would say, Islam and Christendom, or the Ottoman Empire and Christendom. And so, Angela, I thought before we get to readings and so on, it would be useful to sort of fill people in on the background, which may be more familiar to other people here than it was to me, but anyway, some people I'm sure will appreciate.
Great, I just want to say thank you so much again to Edwin for agreeing to join this conversation, to Christine and the whole team at Rizzoli for hosting us, to Angel of the Bulgarian Council here in New York, who's been incredibly welcoming and supportive. Yes, the case of Gem, Slučaj Gem, in Bulgarian. Vera Mutafchieva is a really interesting figure. She was an Ottoman historian, which in Bulgaria was an interesting thing to be, especially during the socialist period, because I think, like a lot of countries in the Balkans, the national narrative was often defined against the Ottomans, against the Turks, and sort of as an othering, whereas she, as a scholar and as a writer, was really interested in the interactions between the Ottomans, the Turks, the Bulgarians, and other peoples in the region. So the basic story, as I'm sure most of you have read the blurb, is about Mehmed the Conqueror's two sons. The law of the House of Ottoman is when the Sultan dies, the oldest son becomes the new Sultan and all the other brothers are strangled. But in this case, yeah, and apparently that was enforced, that law, until Ataturk changed it in like 1920 or something. So it was apparently, whether or not it was enforced, I don't know. If we have any historians here that can fill that in. But so in this case, the one of the younger sons, Jem, was more of a favorite of the army than his older brother, so he was tipped off. He managed to not be strangled, internecine war, and he loses and is exiled to Europe. And that's where the story really starts, about this young man exiled from his homeland, becomes a pawn of powers that he doesn't really understand and can't really see from a bird's eye view like we can 500 years later. And I think what's really interesting about this is that being written in the 1960s in socialist Bulgaria, it was perhaps a way to comment on the Cold War, on this tension between East and West. Her brother had been a defector to France, Vera Mutafchieva's brother, and so this idea of a young man in exile from the East to the West, and this being kind of buffeted by different historical winds that he wasn't in control of and might not have understood at the time, is a really, I think, gives this book a lot of layers in really interesting ways.
Yeah, it has lots of interesting layers, and I mean, in a way, it's also kind of meditation on the beginnings of I guess what we would call modernity. It's also, along with being a historical novel about a stretch of history, which, again, in the West and certainly in the US is not terribly well known. It's also quite an original historical novel in its form, and in that it basically somebody, it's not clear who exactly, interrogates all the characters involved in this. Basically it's 25 years of history from 1480 to about 1500 or something like that. Not quite 25 years. Interrogates the various people, so you have different people coming up before, I guess, the court of history.
Yeah.
Well, that's a strange, I've never seen that done.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was doing background research because unfortunately Vera Mutafchieva is no longer with us. She passed away in 2009, so I had never met her. I think there's people in the room who have met her, and they can comment on that later, but I unfortunately never met her, so I was doing a lot of research, and I found a Bulgarian critic who called this the first modern novel in Bulgarian. I think that's really true because it's really avant-garde in terms of the structure. I think as a historian, she was really interested in getting at that sort of meta history and how, you know, we look back and we can judge and project. And it's really interesting because it's a court case, but the witnesses are ghosts in a sense, because they see the historical perspective. You know, we have you know, some of these characters like the Grand Vizier, that was the Grand Vizier who was Mehmet the Conqueror's Grand Vizier, and he basically is telling about what happened at that time, but he also has the perspective of those 500 years where he's sort of been watching as a specter as how humanity has, I would say, interpreted and reinterpreted those events. And so it's a really interesting structure, especially for someone who's a historian, a professional historian. I think there's lots of historical jokes in here. I think there was a lot of insider jokes for historians in this novel, very purposefully.
Well, it raises the notion, the court of history raises the question of a conclusive judgment. And I was thinking, especially in a kind of determinist Marxist context, that because much of the book, it's hard to, I mean, the riches of the book are both the range of characters, because this allows her the ability to basically have testimony from a whole raft of people, ranging from the head of the Hospitaller movement to the intimate friends of Jem, to incidental characters like paid murderers and a whole range of different people. So you get a kind of panorama of the late medieval world and you also get a kind of parade of different characters. But one thing you don't really get is a final judgment. I mean, the more and more judgment is sort of sought, the more and more things become ambiguous and uncertain in a way in that, which is, and it's a sort of kind of, you're drawn in hoping for resolution, and you're led on, you hope more and more for resolution, but in some sense it dissolves dissolves as you go on. And as it does for some of the characters in the book. But anyway, having talked about the general subject matter of the book and the author a bit, do you want to read a passage to give people a flavor of it?
Sure, I'm going to read not from the beginning, but towards the end. And this is perhaps one of my favorite scenes with Buzz, the publisher. We love this scene, and actually it was the inspiration for the cover. At this point, I don't think this is a spoiler to say that Jem finds himself essentially a prisoner, and he is gifted an interesting pet. So November 10th, 1487. Today we received a thoughtful gift from Brother Domason, a monkey and a parrot. Jem peered at the monk, who brought them with suspicion. In his striving to provide entertainment for his highness, Brother d'Aubusson offers this modest present, the monk whispered. He set down the 2 cages and slipped out. After spending a half hour contemplating the new additions that had disturbed our solitude, Jem got up. He walked around the cages with a distracted air before sitting down on the floor in front of the monkey. I was amused as Jem tried to find a common language with the little creature, making funny faces and gestures, silly sounds. Meanwhile, the monkey was studying him, its new companion, in great detail. It apparently came to some conclusion because it finally stuck its paw through the bars and grabbed hold of Jem's finger. Jem laughed aloud with the new, not quite sane laughter hashish brings on. He opened the cage and picked up the animal. The monkey tolerated this and began playing with Jem's buttons. Then it jumped onto the bed and entertained us with some real monkey business. Saadi, Jem asked me, still laughing. Do you think I can teach it to play chess? Why not, I replied, glad I would now be entirely freed from Jem's heavy, silent presence. You can have the parrot, he said magnanimously. I can't stand the smell of birds. Thus, I became the proud owner of the parrot, exactly what I had so long been missing. I dragged the cage into my little room where there was just enough space for the 2 of us. I dumped it onto the floor, thinking I would let the parrot starve to death. Perhaps that would infuriate Brother d'Aubusson. I was almost out the door when it hit me. There is no God but Allah, I shouted at it. If I repeated those words to it every day, will it learn them?
Well, that passage introduces several of the major characters in the book. And let's start with Jem, who is the one character who doesn't speak throughout the book, and who is, I mean, how did you see him emerging through the pages of this fractured and this kind of prism that the book provides, which gives you, because he's in a way meant to be savior, and on the other hand, at some point Sadi, we'll talk about him, I guess, in a minute too, whose the passage that was, says he was just a spoiled child.
Yeah, no, I think it's interesting, going back to what you were saying before about some historical novels are based on very famous characters or situations and others not. And Jem is an interesting case because he's sort of both, because he was very famous in the 16th century, 17th century with troubadours, Zizim. He was known as Zizim, and there was an entire mythology around him. And so I think Vera Mutafchieva very purposefully doesn't give his point of view because she's sort of playing with this idea that he's always been a figure that others project what they want to see about the East, about their ideas of the Orient, or the Ottomans, that he's this sort of canvas that the other characters project certain, not always well-founded ideas onto. And so I think throughout the book, he's certainly, and he's an interesting, also I think what's important to know is that Jem, and this is I think biographically true, that he is the son of the Sultan, but his mother was a Serbian princess, essentially. So he is physically sort of an incarnation of the East and the West in one body. And so in that sense, this sort of tug of war over Jem is a metaphorical tug of war over the Balkans, over that entire region. And so I think it was a very deliberate decision that he was sort of you never are in his head. Everything is first person narration, which is really interesting. It's all from different points of views, but you never get into his head because he remains this almost not outside of history per se, but this figure that is reinterpreted and misinterpreted by all those around him. So that continues throughout the book. At a certain point, it doesn't matter that he's out of his mind on hashish. Like as long as he exists as an idea, he is useful to the political powers that be. And I think that sort of being robbed of agency is in the structure of the book.
Yeah, I mean, and he's, well, it's interesting, he's both a psychological, I mean, some of the characters like Sadi project psychologically on him and see him as a kind of somebody who represents their desires, but he is also very much a pawn in a game of power politics, of international power politics between the East and West, which is certainly one of the subjects. And there, I mean, the other character you mentioned, the man who sends the monkey, d'Aubusson, who is the head of the Hospitaller Order of the Knights of Rhodes, who is really the main player in the power politics. But those power politics are also seem to be part of the modern interest of the book, because it's one of the stories that she picks up in her own introduction, Mutafchieva, is how Cem, coming from a partly Western and partly Eastern background, is seen as possibly the person who could have brought the Balkans into a kind of historical prominence, as opposed to being sort of caught between two different forces. But that's perpetually frustrated by both sides, and that story of frustration is kind of fascinating. It's quite, but it's incredibly intricate. Yeah. But she professes a kind of frustration that this was the moment when, in effect, somewhere between the desires of Christendom and the Ottomans, the Balkans were sort of pushed aside. So that's a sort of background history here almost.
Yeah, no, I think it's really, her introduction is fascinating, and I would encourage everyone not to skip over it, because it really is, she as a historian sees this as sort of the setting up of the Eastern question, and almost, in some sense, it's almost, she's setting up almost an alternate history, like, well, what if Cem had won? What if, she doesn't go there in the actual story, she sticks with the history, but she really raises this question that if he had been a little less naive, if he had had better advisors, if the West does not look great in this portrait. I mean, the West, you see that, there's a lot of being, disunified. The West is easily disunified, destabilized by gold, by money, by it's a bit this greed, and it's really, and I think part of why she was so interested in this story is, okay, there was, the original idea was that he and his brother would split the empire, and he would take basically what was the European part of the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, and as a sort of half Christian, I mean, he was a Muslim by faith, but his heritage, that there was this idea that perhaps he could have been that sort of transitional or buffer zone in some way, but it just, and she also says, and I think this is really important in the foreword, in her introduction, is that we like to explain, the history of that region through like geographical fatalism. And she said, no, we hear from these people first person. These people made decisions, and they're individual decisions that led, of course, geography has its influence to a certain extent, but then there's also human will. And everyone is kind of called to account for the decisions they made historically, and that had a 500-year legacy on the region.
Yeah, I mean, the basic situation is that he is, it's pretty clear he's playing a losing game from very early in the book. And it's part of the brilliance of the book is to make you feel for him, even as he frustrates you in some ways and frustrates everybody around him as he plays that losing game. But basically, he's held as a bargaining chip by the Knights of Rhodes. And in order to, they will threaten to fund him to let him go to the King of Hungary and then attack the Ottoman Empire. And at the same time, everybody in the West finds him a bargaining chip in their own inner feuds, and he is just more and more pushed to the side. He has his monkey finally. Yes. But he also has his friend. I mean, really the person one comes to love in the book, as you say in your own introduction, is Sadi. Why don't you talk about Sadi?
Yeah, the book is really interesting because it is a number of different witnesses from different, there's Europeans, there's Ottomans, and sort of the main speaker who's portraying Cem's point of view, or perhaps the Ottoman point of view, is Sadi. He's this Persian poet. It's really interesting because he is not, my understanding, I tried to do some research, is that he's not a historical figure. There's no, of this era, there was nobody in Cem's court, but there is a very famous poet, Sadi, from Shiraz in the 12th century, the 13th century, the 1200s, and one of the most famous Persian poets. And so clearly she was drawing on that biography and drawing on some of that poet's work and then putting him into this historical context. And he is, yeah, by far the most likable of any of the characters we get to know. And it's really interesting because he, I think what we like about Cem and I think about Sadi is that he has this, Cem is into poetry, he's sort of seen as almost an enlightener, in the sense that, you know, he's into the Persian tradition there. His court isn't about war, it's not about, you know, politics and intrigue. They sit and they recite poetry and they learn Persian. And so for Sadi is sort of the higher spiritual, I see him as kind of, you know, this sort of higher spiritual striving that Cem and his court at one point stood for. And Sadi stays with him then throughout most of this time. And what's really interesting, I think too, that, I mean, how did this book get published in 1967 in Bulgaria? It becomes clear that they were lovers, and this, you know, homosexual relationship. I was like, wow, this is like, maybe because they weren't Bulgarians, that otherwise it probably wouldn't have been published. But it's really interesting, and the way that, for that readership at that time, but he is so sympathetic that you see how his love for Cem transforms from a romantic love to a friendship love to finally almost like a mother to a child. And then he is, you know, he's, I'd say, one of the only figures that comes through this story sort of unscathed by their own, well, he's a little scathed by his own stupidity at the end, but, you know, it's yeah, Sadi was by and large my absolute favorite character in this book. And
yeah, I mean, it's interesting too, because he, I mean, in a historical novel, which, you know, is sort of battleship of the novel genre, right? I mean, it's a big thing with all. Sadi is a poet, and one of the interesting threads of this book, the sort of imaginative and intellectual threads, is an ongoing kind of reflection about the relationship between poetry and history.
Yes.
Because Cem is supposed to be a poet, though you're never quite sure whether that's, since Cem is in this strange character of being sort of both an emperor who never was an emperor and a kind of zelig, who shows up, and I mean, everybody in the 15th century seems to have been obsessed with him, but we can't. But that poetry, I found that very interesting, that poet, and I wondered about that in terms of, it's often, I think, true of Bulgaria and also Czechoslovakia, that poetry was sort of the central vessel by which historical memory was fostered in the late 19th and 20th century, and whether there's some sort of thinking going on there about in this novel.
That's interesting. I had never thought about that, but yeah, definitely. I mean, there is, you know, there is of course prose in the sort of early Bulgarian modern canon, shall we say? But yeah, I think poetry has always been in Bulgarian literature kind of seen as the ultimate form, and I mean, even in the 90s when the wall fell, I mean, that was poetry was what came out. The sort of jubilant, you know, explosion of literary creativity was focused on poetry in the 1990s, and I mean, Yorgos started as a poet. So yeah, I think that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but I could see where most of the prose, especially during this period, a lot of historical prose, but Vera Mutafchieva, and she did write more straightforward historical novels. In fact, most of her novels are far more kind of straightforward historical novels, but this novel is very unusual in that sense, and maybe she is playing with that idea of introducing this juxtaposition between history and poetry.
Yeah, I mean, she almost seems to be saying, so we live in a world where poetry is impossible, and that's why, in fact, prose has a job in order to actually, you know, anatomize this world where poetry has been rendered voiceless. Because really, Cem and Sadi are progressively strangled, really, in the course of this book. So that, I mean, another theme that is very, very, I mean, well, which is almost the central theme of the book is exile. And that sounds from almost the beginning when, I mean, Cem hesitates before he first steps over the border of the empire to get, well, basically to save his life, but also to get some external influence, because he says, once I leave my home, I will never ever be anywhere. And in some sense, he's correct. I mean, that's the clearest thing he ever found. But that theme of exile is interesting, and that you say in your introduction that Mutafchieva had that had a particular resonance for her, the theme?
I mean, this is what literary critics, many Bulgarian literary critics have discussed this aspect, that the thought is it was quite autobiographical. Her brother defected to France in the early 1960s, from what I can recall. And so this was very, you know, at that time, there really wasn't an opportunity to, you know, use Zoom or Skype or anything. It was really that person was gone, and then there were often repercussions to the family members that remained behind. And so, yeah, in some sense, many literary critics see this as her working out her own grief around her brother's defection by seeing in him this young, talented prince that is forced away in order to live.
Mm-hmm.
But then he trades off, you know, a lot of his identity, a lot of his, you know, for that freedom, for that life.
This is a feat of translation. I mean, it's a great big book. It must have taken a lot of work. It's a book with a whole world of voices going on in it. It's a book riddled with words from various different linguistic backgrounds and so on. It's actually a book in which translation is an issue frequently, because people are spying or pretending to know languages and so on throughout it, or having to, I mean, there's a whole love affair conducted with a translator for those things that need to be translated. But what kinds of challenges and opportunities for you as a translator did this book present?
Yeah, it's interesting because it is clearly written in Bulgarian, but it's not really set in Bulgaria. Like, it's set in a very different realia, and so that to me, because this is a realia that Vera Mutafchieva, as an Ottoman scholar, knew very well, but and in the very opening, she throws the reader, and there are many, you know, Turkish words in Bulgarian. I think that the sounding of Turkish is very familiar to Bulgarian, so in some sense, it's not as foreign as, you know, some of the words that she uses that as it would be to, say, an English reader, but it definitely, there are things that, you know, my asking Bulgarian readers, like, do you know what this is? And then, no, we don't know this word. So there's definitely she balances on this line of a familiar foreignness. Okay, she's talking about the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, but she's also talking about Bulgaria in the socialist period. So this very delicate balance of, she wants you to feel a little bit like you're somewhere different, but not that different, so that you see the parallel. And so this was hard because we don't, of course, in my English at least, you know, we don't have that relationship to Turkish, to the Ottoman Empire. And so I wanted to keep some of the flavor of trying to, you know, the atmosphere of the Ottoman court, you know, Cem's courts, but without, you know, from the first page alienating the English reader entirely, because there's many things she just doesn't translate. She just, you know, and some of them Bulgarians will pick up on, from the context it'll become clear, like, you know, giving the ranks of the army, you know, things that they'll pick up on. But that was really tough to get the balance of being faithful to this atmosphere that she's creating without it being too foreign, because we have another level of removal being translated into English. So that was difficult. And I think the fact that it's all first-person narratives, trying to distinguish the voices, and be consistent between the voices, because we hear a lot. Sadi is almost every other chapter. There'll be one chapter from another narrator, and then Sadi. And this, keeping those voices consistent throughout the novel, making sure that there's distinctions between the voices, the historical jokes too. There are some things that, there's almost no footnotes in this. She basically just throws you in and you get what you get. And actually the only footnote is from D'Aubusson himself. It's like one of the characters gives a footnote to his own testimony. And I kept that because I really didn't want to footnote things, because she really wanted I think she intended the reader to kind of be swimming in history and kind of not knowing who to trust or what to believe. But that said, there are these sort of jokes, you know, there's this kind of, you know, murder for hire guy, real, you know, kind of creepy character at the end, Battista Spagnola, and I was digging to see, is this a historical character? It turns out there's a Doge of Genoa. So I think it's a kind of very subtle joke about how she thinks of the morality of politicians, you know, in the 15th century and possibly in the 20th century. So there's a couple different things where she and I think Sadi is really interesting. I think in general most of the history is very well researched, but then she takes a 13th century Persian poet and makes him the central character of an otherwise very historically accurate novel. So there's these sort of jokes that and tricks, I would say, historically, that I really wanted to keep, but not give away. I didn't want to footnote and make it, kind of serve it on a platter to the English reader.
It's kind of amazing how she establishes this double perspective of the long historical gaze, which in some sense, in which most of us have forgotten all these details, right? The things that mattered so much to people then have become just, history. And then also, which is a kind of confusion that we all live in, and sort of ignorance that we all live in, but also that she throws us into the middle of the near historical thing, while all these people are scheming and trying to outgame each other and outcalculate each other, or just survive. So that you're sort of in the confusion of the moment and in the confusion of the retrospect or of posterity at the same time, or this double confusion is kind of a brilliant tour de force, especially since it's quite suspenseful.
And I think what really makes it work, that sort of double layers, is that she's a really good psychologist. Like, these people are realistic and believable in their 15th century context, but you completely understand their motive. I mean, yes, that's how people are. That's how people are in 2023. And I think that's where kind of the genius of the storytelling, that she makes them believable historical figures that are absolutely relatable to a contemporary person and reader, which kind of makes you feel like, human nature has not changed one bit at all.
Yeah, and well, yes, she's very good at the skullduggery as well,
Yes.
and the people hiding. And the book is full of sharp turns of fortune, which, I mean, again, one of Jem's sort of fates is to survive while everybody around him is offed in one way or the other. But it's really quite good. Why don't you read another? You were thinking, so you had several passages today you were talking about, and give us another sentence.
Okay. Sorry, I have my list of excerpts here that I wanted to. Sorry. This is a big book, and I won't find the pages if I just leaf through. Sorry, I lost my page. Here we go. Okay, so I think maybe we talked about how the troubadours saw Jem, and I think since we've been talking about history, that's an interesting. So this is from Sadi, but he's explaining kind of why Jem captured the imagination of his time, but then also our time. I sense you do not know who turned Jem into a famous name, nor when or why. Indeed, history has seen far more misfortunate, heroic, dignified princes, to say nothing of more wondrous and talented poets. So you surely think, and with good reason. Yet it was precisely Jem who remained in the legends of several countries, with characteristics attributed to him that none of us, his closest companion, had ever noticed. I hardly imagine I'm revealing some unknown truth to you when I say that song did this. Song could do much, and therein lies the retribution that God gives to the poet for all the pains men suffer. The poet has more power than the king, because he governs not human life, but human consciousness. With a single line, as long as it is sharp and elegant and hits its target, the poet can destroy what an earthly ruler has striven to build over decades. With a word, he can raise a monument, and that monument lasts through centuries, floods, invasions, and fires. He can build a monument to the most insignificant and unheeded peon of his time. It is no accident that in my day, rulers held poets in contempt, yet indulged them. They paid them the full measure of their scorn only posthumously. They did not allow poets to rest in hallowed ground. Beyond the cemetery walls, there you should seek the bones of hundreds of troubadours. But kings fed living poets from golden plates and poured them wine in golden cups. Don't think our kings were fools. They had to contend with the harsh law of the Middle Ages. And being clever, they flattered the poet because they knew his strength. Permit me to offer you one piece of advice. After all, I've been observing for more than 5 centuries. Do not insult poets. Choose your enemies elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's interesting that Jem, I mean, is in some way that I think it is a book where the triumph of poetry is, I mean, in a worldly fashion, Jem is a disaster. But at some level, this book makes the love people felt for him and the desire that things turn out better, that he somehow incarnates a lasting hope of history, however often defeated. So that's part of the pathos of the book, which along with its suspense and color, and it's a quite wonderful book. Maybe we should have some questions now.
Could you say more about how this book was received in Bulgaria when it was first published?
It was incredibly successful. So Vera Mutafchieva had been, primarily a scholar, a historian, but after the success of GEM, she more or less turned primarily to writing fiction, and she's, author of dozens of books. So this was sort of a watershed, and this is by far her most popular and best known novel in Bulgarian. It had been translated into almost every European language. There's like 4 editions in Turkey as well, so this is clearly an interesting story for Turkish readers. So when we were hoping to translate this, it was really interesting that English was really the kind of odd man out, that we don't have access to this text, which had been very, very popular and well received in Bulgaria and in the region.
Okay, thank you. I knew her personally, and I knew her from the side of Ottoman history, but I wasn't familiar with her novels. And were her other books also about Ottoman and Turkish-related subjects, her other works of fiction?
No, some of them are, but there are like Byzantine, there's some that deal with Byzantine history, with Bulgarian sort of medieval history. So no, not this is sort of unusual in that it's further afield from Bulgaria specifically. Yeah.
May I make two comments along with that? Because first of all, the power struggles. Bulgaria, even after 1944, had gone through a lot of power struggles, not least in the late 1940s, and those were still fresh in the minds of people when this book was published. The other thing is that Ottomanists like Vera Mutafchieva had a big problem in Bulgaria because the only sources that they could turn to, other than published books that were published elsewhere, were the part of the Ottoman archives that wound up in Bulgaria, which wound up there in the 1930s when they were scrap paper was sent to Bulgaria for processing, and it turned out to be part of the rich archives of the Ottoman Empire. So anybody who was doing Ottoman research in Bulgaria, especially in the 60s, was really frustrated because you could find bits and pieces, random documents, things didn't fit together, and it must have been a wonderful burst of relaxation to be able to sit down and fantasize and throw a human dimension onto a random collection in Ottoman of taxation and census documents.
No, I think definitely I could see where fiction would be an outlet for that, where you've got the historical structure, but then she's able to spin and fill in the blanks. So because I think she's very conscientious about the history in the book, but then she's not afraid to play with it as well, which I think is really interesting as a professional historian. That feels that doesn't feel boxed in by strict historicity.
Thank you. First, happy to see you here, Angela. You became a household name in Bulgaria, first making a book, a new classic, and then translating another classic. You mentioned that there are many layers to the book, and you, as an interpreter, you get very intimate with the book, you get very close. So I'm curious, did you find some Easter eggs, some hidden messages that were pretty much planted there as a way of the expression of the author?
I mean, I think definitely it was a way to speak publicly about her grief, about her brother, without really saying it out loud. There's another maybe more controversial aspect of Vera Mutafchieva, that shortly before her death in 2009, she was exposed as having been an informant of the communist era secret services. And I mean, this probably shouldn't have come as a surprise, because her father was a very well-known, like, bourgeois historian of Byzantine history. And then once her brother was a defector, this was the type of person that would be forced to collaborate with the services. But I wondered, in that scene that Edwin mentioned about the border, if there wasn't this idea that Jem is saying, okay, if I cross the border, I'm gonna be alive, but I'm gonna be turning my back, and basically I'm gonna have to become an enemy of my people, of my home, of everything. And I was wondering if there wasn't a little bit of, you know, personal agony being, you know, sort of, she saw herself as Jem, as someone who was in this kind of no-win situation. If, you know, she hadn't agreed to collaborate, then she wouldn't have been able to have a career, she wouldn't have been able to publish, she wouldn't have been able to do anything. But on the other hand, it's also going against that which you hold precious, you know, in Jem's case, his country, his, you know, his family. So I wondered, I don't know, I've never seen a literary critic talk about that, but it just struck me that maybe there was an undercurrent of her own, you know, sort of struggling with this untenable political situation that she found herself in very personally. But that's my own conjecture completely, so.
Well, and the book could also be seen as a book which thinks about how, I mean, you said her brother had left. Whether you leave or whether you go, you're caught within this larger nexus of power politics, where you, as the individual, are in some sense are sacrificed, and that I think is the large tragic message of the book. Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you for coming to New York. Professor Dr. Mutafchieva is, I'm sure you're aware, some sort of kind of controversial writer, because she was one of the first that threw light about the Turkish slavery the way we know it. She kind of provided arguments that it wasn't slavery in the American sense of the word, which you would agree, I believe, because America has its own experience with slavery, and therefore the Bulgarian past doesn't fit into that. She also mentions that the Russian soldiers that liberated Bulgaria found people that have houses and land, something that the soldiers themselves didn't have. So my question is, sorry, it's not related to the book directly, but like, would you be willing to translate some of those publications, or that would be too much politically controversial? Because it would kind of say that Bulgaria didn't have slavery in the sense of the American word.
Yeah, this is for the people who aren't Bulgarian here, to give a bit of background. During the 20th century, I think that the narrative about the Ottoman period in Bulgaria was often couched in the term of robstvo in Bulgarian, which means slavery. But clearly within the Ottoman Empire, this isn't anything that could be at all, you know, parallel to a chattel slavery type situation. And so in Bulgaria, that term is no longer, I think it's falling out of use, and is certainly in textbooks and in sort of public discourse. Bulgarians are moving away from the idea of, you know, couching their history in terms of this, because the Ottoman Empire was a very complex empire. It was basically based on your religious, you know, Muslims, of course, had other rights, and then, you know, Christians, they had some rights, but they also had to pay extra taxes. So it wasn't, you know, an equal society in the sense that, you know, we think of it in contemporary Europe. But I think she as a historian is really interesting, because I think she clearly is fascinated by and sees many positive things about the Ottoman Empire and the Ottoman period. And so I see her as someone, as a public intellectual, like certainly she wrote things that were controversial, that were sort of, you know, belletristics, but I think it was important to have a figure of her stature that was interested in Bulgarians' Ottoman past, because it's really like my daughter. I have a 15-year-old daughter, and I watch what they do in history. Even to this day, it's like they go from like the 12th century to like, you know, the 18th, 19th century, and there's very little said about that period. So I think the fact that she dedicated her clearly very, you know, intense intellectual capabilities specifically that period of Bulgarian history in and of itself is extremely interesting, and I think shows that she felt it was something that needed to be taken out more. I generally stick to fiction. I haven't done a lot of, I guess with Georgi Gospodinov, I do some of his nonfiction essays. It would be interesting. I read a lot of her work around this translation, just to kind of get an idea, since I never was able to meet her, the sense of her as an intellectual, as a writer, as a thinker. And there are some really interesting things that she talks about. And I think, it's a very complicated question. I think Bulgarians are still in the process of how we think of, I'm a Bulgarian citizen now, I guess too, but how to think about the communist period, how to think about the Ottoman period, what kind of language should we use to talk about those very painful and complicated parts of Bulgarian history. And I think Vera Mutafchieva is a part of that discussion, but it's still ongoing.
The book makes a big case for the Ottoman Empire as much more sophisticated than Christendom, and uses also the empire, and also uses the empire to introduce a critique of nationalism, and because the empire is extra national rather than anyway.
Thank you. This is just actually a quick question circling back to the first question that was asked in this context you were just discussing. You said the book was translated into Turkish and maybe some of her other work was. I was wondering if you know anything about the reception of this book or her work more broadly in Turkey, because it's interesting, like somebody, kind of from the region, but from without writing about Turkish history.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't actually. I just saw that there were like 4 different editions in Turkish, and it was very interesting to me, but I don't speak Turkish, I don't have access to that, so I have no idea how it was received. So that's an interesting question to look into if anybody has access to Turkish here.
Last call. Anyone else? Okay, last question.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations for choosing to translate this book. It's an amazing book. I mean, this is absolutely fantastic book. And I'm sure that anyone who would read the translation will be fascinated first by the style of Vera Mutafchieva. She's absolutely unique writer for Bulgaria in this particular period. And second, from the whole story, which is extremely unusual as a plot in Bulgarian literature in the 60s, and maybe it is as it is just because it was written in the 60s. I mean, a book like, can you imagine a book like this in the 80s, for instance? 20 years ago, it is completely unimaginable.
It sounds very contemporary, though. I feel like you could read it. I think it's written in 2023. I mean, the structure.
Maybe this is the new wave of the 60s, blowing to Bulgaria. That man can feel in this particular book. And you mentioned there's many layers in this book, and it's the poetry, I think, is the main layer. And one thing that actually struck me when I read the book is the attitude of the author, Vera Mutafchieva, towards the characters and towards the historical background. When she writes about Ottoman Empire, she doesn't write about a foreign country. This is her own history. I mean, and that's probably the answer to the question of the gentleman over there in the back.
Yeah, and I think that in and of itself is in that time, in that sort of intellectual environment, was very, very bold. Very bold. Yeah.
And there's also, I think someone asked about other books from Vera Mutafchieva about this. Yes, she wrote another one about early 19th century, the Chronicles, which is also an amazing book.
Yeah,
And there again, it's about this relation between West and East, and the power politics and the people who are locked inside their own expectation, and that turn out to be a personal disillusion in the end. Again, an amazing book. I strongly recommend you.
Yeah, no, she's a brilliant psychologist. I mean, absolutely brilliant. So it's funny and it's great.
It's playful.
Yeah, it's playful. Yeah, as you saw from some of the excerpts.
We can close there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.